During this lecture, we're going to discuss contractual terms, the terms that are contained in the typical contract in the football industry. Contractual agreements play a crucial role in the football industry. They effectively cement the relationship between various different participants in the industry. In particular, you have the agent-player relationship, the player-club relationship, notably, and various other relationships. Obviously, you have a manager and club relationship and so forth. So during this lecture, we're going to have a look at some of the key terms that are inserted in these contracts. We're going to focus mainly on the relationship between player-agent and, to a certain extent, the player-club relationship. So, why have a written contract? Well, let's imagine, for instance, you enter into an agreement with another person where you agree to pay that person a sum of money, let's say £10,000, in return for building work to renovate your house. So the builder starts running out of money gradually. He keeps asking for an advance of the money that you owe him under the agreement. So eventually the builder has been paid the whole sum of money. You've given him the whole £10,000 under the agreement to complete the renovation works on your property. And after you pay the builder this money, he no longer turns up for the work to perform the renovation work, the building work, and despite your best efforts, he refuses to complete the job. Now a dispute arises between you and the builder. In that scenario, it shall be very difficult to claim compensation for a breach of contract unless all rights and obligations of the parties have been set out in a written agreement. If it was a handshake agreement or an oral agreement between you and the builder could say, for instance, his understanding of the agreement was that he was to only complete the works that he did complete for the £10,000 that he was given, and that further payments must be made in order to complete the job. So that emphasizes the importance of having a written contract, especially in any commercial setting. And the contract itself must be clearly worded. The terms of the agreement between you and the other party must be clearly worded. So the importance of having an agreement is therefore essentially to protect the interests of the parties to the agreement, to ensure that both parties fulfill their side of the bargain. For instance, you offer to pay for either a product or a particular type of service from another party, and the person reneges or fails to provide you with the product, or fails to supply the service that they say they're going to provide in return for the money. Therefore, a dispute arises between you and the other side, and you can claim compensation for breach of contract where you have a written agreement. So by including clearly worded agreements, the parties shall be legally bound effectively. And by legally bound, we mean that where there is a dispute between the parties to the contract, whether that's a player-agent or player-club relationship, the injured party can bring an action before a tribunal, court, or any other form of dispute resolution that is set out in the terms of the contract and claim damages for a breach of contract. So before turning to have a look at the essential terms to be included in a contract, what is a contract? Well, in most circumstances where the parties enter into an agreement, the validity of a contract may not be disputed by the parties. However, there are fundamental points to bear in mind when entering into negotiations with a party with a view to form a contractual agreement. So, a contract has been defined as an agreement giving rise to obligations which are enforced or recognised by law. The factor which distinguishes contractual from other legal obligations is that they are based on the agreement of the contracting parties. So it's clear from that definition that a contract can be concluded between the parties either verbally or orally. You can reach an agreement between another party either, as I said, by word of mouth or during a discussion or in written form. However, the problem I outlined at the outset was in the verbal agreement scenario, where there is a disagreement between the parties, it can be difficult for a court and/or tribunal or other form of dispute resolution mechanism to determine which party's claim is true, because one party will say one thing, another party may say another thing. Where a dispute arises, that is often the case, because by virtue of the fact that there's a dispute, it means there's some disagreement between the parties. So in that type of scenario, it's very difficult for a court, tribunal or any other dispute resolution mechanism to resolve the matter, to identify what the true position is, because both parties will have their own claim, and it's going to create uncertainty for both parties, therefore, to the contract. Either party could win. So that's a very uncertain position when you're dealing in a commercial context. You want a degree of certainty. So to improve, to enhance, to strengthen the agreement and protect one's interests, you outline those rights and obligations clearly in a written agreement. So next we shall turn to have a look at some of the terms to be included in a written agreement. So as I said at the beginning, we're going to have a look at particularly at the agent-player, club-player relationship and the terms that will be included in those types of contracts. But we're going to have a look at them on a very superficial level at first. We're going to have a look at the fixed terms, the terms that you would find in even any standard contract, basically, between parties to the agreement. So in the agent-player, club and player relationships, all these parties are bound together by the contractual agreement that they have entered into. So the importance of, as I said, of having a contractual agreement is that it embodies the rights and obligations of the parties. So a player has a duty to perform a certain function as a player, whether that's whatever position that may be in, as a defender, midfielder, as a striker, as a goalkeeper, for instance, for a particular club. So that's his obligation, and those obligations will be set out in a contract between the player and club. And the club has an obligation in return for the player's services as a player, as a professional footballer, to pay that player a certain sum of money. Now, those rights and obligations will be clearly outlined in the contract, so there's no dispute between the parties. And if a dispute does transpire, any dispute resolution mechanism or court or tribunal that is determining the dispute shall be able to determine that dispute, discern or interpret the clauses and obligations and rights of the parties from the contractual agreement, and arrive at a definitive decision and a fair decision based on the agreement between the parties and clearly outlined in the contract. So at the outset, we see that one of the main terms in a contract, a fixed term, is the parties to be stipulated in the contract. If it's a player, the player's name will be included in the contract. His name, perhaps his personal details, his date of birth, and perhaps his nationality, and so forth and so forth. Now, the club will also be included in the contract. Whether that club, let's say for example, we have West Ham, their name would be included in the contract. West Ham, Manchester City, for instance, Arsenal, Tottenham Hotspur, irrespective of the club itself, but they would be another party to the contract between a player and club. So the parties are always included in the contract. They're clearly outlined at the very top of the contract. From reading a contract, you will always note that the parties are at the very top. So that's one of the terms. Where you negotiate a contract with another party, make sure the names of the parties to the contract, whether it's an agent-player contract, agent-club contract, or the player-club contract. Make sure the parties are clearly set out in the contract. So next, let's have a quick look at the types of rights that an agent would have or intermediary in the intermediary agent player relationship or intermediary agent club relationship. Well, first of all, the agent would have a right to be paid a commission for representing a player and or club, and the amount of that commission would also be stipulated within the contract. So whether that's 3%, 5%, 10%, whatever the case may be, those are topics that would be negotiated between the agent and the other party, whether that's a particular player or a particular club. Also, the method of those payments could be stipulated within the terms of the contract. For instance, the payments could be made at certain intervals, like monthly or quarterly, biannually, annually, whatever the case may be. That would be for the parties to agree upon. And also, when the contract would come to an end, that would be clearly stipulated in the contract. For instance, in some National Football Association rules, there's a maximum duration upon which a contract can be entered into between for instance, the intermediary or agent and player, and that's currently set at 2 years. So the beginning and ending of the contract, the beginning and ending dates would be clearly outlined in the contract, and the parties, of course, would sign the agreement also. The fact that there's an ending date to the contract, though, it's just worth noting that it doesn't mean bring the relationship to a permanent end. It just means that the parties will be free to go their own way or to renegotiate the contract and enter into a fresh agreement. So the mere fact that there's an ending date doesn't necessarily mean that the relationship is ended permanently. The parties, as I said, they're free to re-enter a new contract after negotiating fresh terms, or on the same terms if that's what they consent to, if both parties are happy with continuing the agreement on the same basis. So now let's have a look at some of the terms that may be included, outlining the rights and duties of the player and or club within a contract. Well, for instance, the player, for instance, would have a right to be paid for playing for the particular club, as I said previously. The amount that the player should be paid, to say that the player's salary for playing for the club, the method of those payments, so the intervals, once again, how those payments will be made, weekly, monthly, whatever the case may be, and other terms such as, especially professional player contracts between the player and club. There may be performance-related bonuses, for instance, or other types of bonuses. Those do not fall under what are known as fixed terms. Those are regarded as contingency terms, a little bit more complicated. So we will discuss those in more depth during a later lecture. But there'll be all different types of contractual terms included within the agreement, especially where the player is high profile, is playing for an elite club, such as a Premier League club. There'll be a variety of different terms. But let's stick with the fixed terms, the basic terms for this during this lecture. And as I said, we shall explore the more complex terms in more depth during one of our later lectures. So the contract shall also specify when the contract expires and the player becomes a free agent, for instance, in the player-club relationship. And that is, once again, it doesn't mean to say that brings a contract to a permanent end. The club is perfectly entitled, if it wishes, to approach the player with a view to renegotiating fresh terms with the player. And likewise, the player is free to agree new terms with the club if he's happy with the new terms, or even on the same terms if the player and the club consent to enter into a new agreement on the same terms. Let us now recap on the topics we've just covered. So we've discussed how a contract includes what are known as contractual terms or clauses. That's the body of the contract, the contents of the contract. And those terms, they provide clarification about the rights and obligations of the parties to the contract. And those rights and obligations bind the parties together in a commercial sense. In other words, one party agrees to supply a certain service or provide a certain product, and the other party normally is going to pay that person in return for the product or service that is received. Now, as I said, the terms, these contractual clauses and terms stipulate the rights and obligations of the parties to the agreement, and a breach of any of those rights and obligations, or a breach of the terms, should I say, allows the injured party to claim damages for breach of contract. So, in a nutshell, that's what a contract is. So these are matters that should be clearly set out in the contractual agreement between the parties. That's to say that the terms, in the form of terms and or clauses, it is not until a dispute arises between the parties about the rights and or obligations of their rights and or obligations under a contract that the spotlight focuses on the importance of the wording of the terms and or clauses outlined in the contract. In other words, where a dispute arises, normally it should be stipulated within the contract. So a third party, whether that's a tribunal, court, or another form of dispute resolution mechanism, can interpret the wording of the contract and arrive at a definitive conclusion about what the agreement was between the parties, or what a particular party's obligation or right was under that particular agreement. So it's clear that this highlights the importance of agents or intermediaries, the representatives of young players, or even a player representing him or herself, familiarising themselves with a contract and the contractual clauses contained within a typical agreement. In the case of a player or representative of a young player, that is also the case, because it places them in a stronger position, even if the young player is represented by an agent or the player is represented by an agent. It still places the player and or the representative of the young player in a stronger position to advise the agent or advise the person representing the other party to the contract when they are familiar with these contractual terms. It is also worth just knowing about these things, given the importance that the contracts play within the industry, and especially where a player is representing him or herself, or a representative of a young player, whether that's a parent or another relative and so forth. It is worth familiarising yourself with the contracts and the contractual terms, just so that you understand, given the importance that they play within the club player agent relationship, for instance. We're now going to watch this short animated video that we created highlighting the role played by an agent during the player transfer process. Give you a good insight into how the preliminary discussions start between player agent and agent club prior to the parties entering into a contract. So, for instance, where the player enters into a contract with a new club.
Player A wants to move to a new football club, or Club A wants to sign a new player from a different club. In either of these scenarios, Player A or Club A shall approach a football intermediary to represent them during the transfer process. This process shall involve discussions and negotiations between the parties until the player has signed for the new club, or the deal falls through for one reason or another. Another example of an intermediary's role is where club wants to sign a new player to fill a vacant position in the team, or just add strength to the team. In this type of situation, the buying and selling club shall request an intermediary to represent them throughout the transfer process. Once again, this shall involve the parties discussing important issues during negotiations. During contract negotiations, the intermediary shall be involved in negotiating the contractual terms of the transfer, which can include the transfer fee, a player's salary, and performance bonuses, among other things.